This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So in terms of why we decided to have this event, as I was saying just before we start, I mean, this is the centre of research history in the UK. I think it's important to actually mark an event like the Dublin Easter Rising here. It's important also, I think, this is what we try and do, is, through research history, to actually have people that have been looking at the history of 1916, thinking about what it means, perhaps discovering new points about it, raising issues and so on, because it's not just about, there's been a lot for people that have been following it. I haven't been over myself, but I've spoken to people that have, and Dublin kind of resembles a 1916 theme park at the moment, in terms of, it's a big huge official event in Ireland. Much less so, of course, here, where not a great deal has been said. But, these days with social media, obviously that's not quite the same. There have been various Twitter feeds, and ones you might have seen, which I think you can probably still get hold of, which I pulled out of, that was the Morning Star. Is www.1960live.com. They've been posting documents from the Bodleian, actually dealing with information that was actually put out at the time. So it says many a timestamp to the minute, allowing the public to trace the course of events as they unfolded. And that they look out to that on Twitter, and there are various other such things. So there has been kind of a lot more contemporary material available perhaps than there would have been even 10 years ago, to allow people to actually perceive things themselves. And there has been some kind of limited, there was a quite interesting exhibition which was timed of course for actual Easter as opposed to the anniversary at the Photographer's Gallery just down near Oxford Circus, and that, I thought, obviously there's very little photographic evidence of the Rising itself for obvious reasons. Taking photographs get shot by the British, so that wasn't really possible in that sense. But the photographic background to it, which was there, is very interesting. And I was particularly struck, for example, by some pictures of a British regiment that had been within the year of appearing in Dublin to put down the Rising. Been in Mesopotamia and various other British imperial outposts, and it really kind of underlined what British imperial power was all about, and how they viewed what the events were in Dublin. So I think that was interesting. There has been some limited official comment. I'm afraid that Jeremy Corbyn hasn't managed to repeat his call for the constant market statue at Holloway Prison, which he did make in October 2015, but he may have been busy. But in the Daily Telegraph, there was an opinion piece by Simon Heffer, and I won't bother to read it if you want, but the opening sentence says, "All nations make catastrophic mistakes, and one of Britain's was in its relations with Ireland and the handling of the Easter Rising a century ago." There we are. So, only 100 years on, the Telegraph is prepared to admit that perhaps it wasn't quite ideal in terms of how things went in 1916. But that was interesting in the sense that a Conservative paper noted that and was prepared to admit that there were a few minor problems with British imperialism then, obviously not now. There has been stuff. So I'm not going to go on any longer, because I'm not primarily a historian of 1916 in terms of the Easter Rising anyway, but we do have 4 speakers who most certainly are, and we're going to go with the order that you can see up there. So first off, Chris Bambery, who you may have seen, and if you haven't, there are some copies here, written a very interesting piece in military history. So, Chris.
I want to start by making it clear that Ireland in 1916 was a colony, formally part of the United Kingdom, but a colony. If you want to make a contrast with, say, Scotland or Wales, in Ireland there was a viceroy, a Lord Lieutenant, as in Derry. The police were an armed police, concerned not with crime, but with counterinsurgency and countering unrest on the land. And the whole structure of it was run by a British administration, alien to Ireland, backed up by an ascendancy class who are essentially Anglo-Irish, British in terms of that. And of course the Rising has been a contentious issue in Irish history even from the beginning, very first shots, but the centenary of it has, I would argue, for reasons which are more to do with today's Ireland, led to a considerable knocking back of what I'm going to call the revisionist history of 1916. And that is primarily because what is happening, as I say, in Ireland currently, has led to a tremendous interest in what the reality of the Rising was, rather than the mythology of the revisionist case. What I mean by the revisionist case is the acceptance in academia and in political circles that this was a blood sacrifice. The former deputy editor of the Irish Times describes the leaders of the Rising as ideologues with no electoral support, prepared to kill and destroy in pursuit of their political aims, and cuts quickly to the central point of revisionism, which is that there are long shadows helped inspire IRA campaigns in practically every decade since 1922. And the revisionist case came into existence really post-1968-69 in response to the rise of the provisional IRA and its military campaign, and the determination to crush out really any idea that the Easter Rising was a good thing. So we have a former Fine Gael Taoiseach, John Bruton, arguing, for instance, in the build-up to the centenary, that it wasn't necessary to have a rising, that Britain would have granted home rule, and eventually by constitutional means Ireland would have become independent. All of this is completely ahistorical. By just simply taking the Rising and looking at it just in those few days, that 1 week of fighting, it rips it out of its context. And the context is a revolutionary crisis which begins with the introduction of the Third Home Rule Bill in 1912 and which continued to 1923 with the end of the Civil War and the counter-revolution's victory. Incidentally, this is the foundation of the Irish state which exists today, not 1916. The defeat of the Republican forces by the new Free State, and a situation of radicalisation, which meant that in 1916, yes, the leaders of the Rising were in a minority, but, and considerable research has gone into this, the traditional mythology that they were booed and attacked by the people of Dublin at the end is not accurate. There was quite widespread support and admiration for them at the course of play, from some quite unlikely sources, actually. And there were scenes of people actually going out of their way to cheer them, despite the bayonets of the British Army being used against them. And that radicalisation, the beginning of the revolutionary crisis, the first and important thing to get into place is what happened in reaction to the Home Rule Bill, which is the reaction of the Unionists and the Conservatives here in Britain, which is to create an armed militia, to import rifles from Germany on a mass scale, some 50,000 in July 1914. An interesting date, just think about it. July 1914, 50,000 rifles from Germany. Right? The British Army refusing orders to intervene, mutinying at the Curragh. When the Asquith government demanded they disarm Ulster. The reaction of the British security forces when the Irish volunteers imported just 1,500 weapons into Howth, which was to try and seize those weapons, and then to open fire on a civilian crowd in the streets of Dublin, killing 4 of them. In other words, the gun was firmly in place in Irish politics by 1914. It wasn't the blood sacrifice of the Easter Rising that put it there, it was there. The second element that meant someone like Padraig Pearse, the first president of the Irish Republic, would move from cultural nationalism to support for the Home Rule Party, the Irish National Party, to the Irish Republican Brotherhood and military separatism, is to put it in context as well, a reaction to what was happening in the northeast of Ireland, but also an awareness that what was on offer in terms of Home Rule fell far short of any national aspiration. What was on offer is essentially, in modern terms, the creation of something broadly similar to the Welsh Assembly, not the Scottish Parliament. Subject to a veto by Westminster in all its decisions and by the Crown, with a Lord Lieutenant still in place, and then in reaction to the Conservative and Liberal bloc, the trimming by John Redmond, head of the Irish National Party, for instance, rowing back on the new Irish Parliament's right to impose customs, and more importantly in 1914, agreeing to the exclusion of at least 6 counties of Ulster from the control of the Irish Parliament, in other words, partition. So by 1914, a considerable body of people who have supported Home Rule are beginning to move in a more radical direction. The third element is John Redmond and the Irish National Party support for the First World War, and a recruitment drive to recruit for the British Army. Successful in the first year and a half, but it's important to say that by 1916, Easter 1916, recruitment had fallen off in Ireland. In fact, all parts of Ireland, interestingly, despite the unionist mythology, recruitment had virtually come to an end. And by the Easter Rising, the tide had turned against it. And people like John Dillon, vice chair of the Irish National Party, were aware that their support was trickling away because of their support for the First World War. And the final element in this as well is the recomposition of the British government at the beginning of 1916, having put the Home Rule Bill through in August 1914. They then meant it was not being enacted till the end of the war. People were now sceptical about when the war would end, but more importantly, in the beginning of 1916, a new coalition government was formed under Asquith, which included Bonawa, the Conservative leader who had made some of the fiercest speeches threatening civil war if the Home Rule Bill went through. F.E. Smith, future Lord Birkenhead, known as a galloper for his participation in the UVF, and Sir Edward Carson, leader of the Ulster Unionists. By this stage, most nationalists in Ireland would have thought the chances of this government implementing Home Rule would be remote. The next element I want to say is in terms of the blood sacrifice. The idea that these people were just simply ideologues prepared to kill and destroy is fanciful. It's unusual for me to recommend a book by Roy Foster, but I would recommend Vivid Faces, which looks at that generation. The people who came together to make 1916. Feminists, socialists, cultural nationalists, Republicans. And what comes out of that Foster's book is a portrayal pre-1916 of a very radical milieu, for instance, quite sexually liberated, not just in support of women's suffrage, but much more. Right? These are the people who make the Rising. Even the demonised Padraig Pearse, who made some silly remarks about blood sacrifice, did make some silly remarks about it, but it has to be said it was common coin in 1914. If you read the poems of Rupert Brooke, great English feature, he's making the same points. It's absolutely common good. But actually Pearse is a fairly attractive character in my opinion. A radical educationalist, opposed to the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, as was Thomas MacDonagh. Pearse, Clark, MacDonagh had supported the workers of Dublin in the 1913 lockout. They were sympathetic to the women's suffragette movement, which is why when you read the proclamation, it contains statements far in advance in terms of democracy, which anything existed in Britain at the time, and indeed anything which exists in the Irish Republic of Northern Ireland today, in terms of the promise. I mean, to give women the vote, which is what that proclamation does, and to declare even the first sentences to Irish men and Irish women is a radical statement. I would defend, another time to talk about James Connolly's participation in the Rising and also his decision to make an alliance with these people. They weren't socialists, but they were radical Democrats, radical nationalists, far more attractive incidentally than the future leaders of Sinn Féin and the IRA post-1916. In some ways it's a tragedy they were short because they were much more advanced. These were not people who were out to commit suicide. And their object of the Rising was twofold, I would argue. First, in terms of the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, a belief that they had to make a rising to get Ireland to the conference table when the war came to an end. And that was articulated and very, very clear. For Connolly, it was a much wider thing. Firstly, he wanted the Rising to stop partition, which he said was going to be a carnival reaction, and boy was he proved right about that. But secondly, he believed the Irish Rising in Dublin was necessary to reawaken the European working class and to bring about opposition, to rebuild that movement and bring about opposition to the First World War. And actually, I'd argue is part of the process. You have to put 1916 and what would come in France, in Germany, Russia, and elsewhere in terms of that. So this wasn't a blood sacrifice. But more importantly, the Rising itself was a very carefully designed thing. These people were not going out to throw their lives away. The original plan was complicated in the sense the leadership of the Irish volunteers, about 15,000 in number, the formal leadership were in the hands of non-Republicans, Owen McNeill, Bulmer Hobson, who broke it with the IRIB. The actual cadre of it was the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Their problem was to get a rising, was to convince the leadership to call it. And therefore they devised a scheme whereby it's still argued whether a document was real or fabricated, showing the British were about to implement mass arrests, arguing that the Irish volunteers, now in alliance with the Irish Citizens' Army of James Connolly, had to rise, and further bringing McNeill into the plan, which is in Louth, to bring thousands of German rifles into Kerry and subsequently to arm the volunteers in the southwest of Ireland in support of Dublin. I'll come back to that. That plan, of course, was scuppered. It was scuppered by McNeill calling off the rising as it was planned on the Sunday. It was scuppered by the Royal Navy intercepting the order, bringing the guns in from Germany and those weapons being lost. The decision to go ahead with the rising Easter Monday, 24 hours later, was taken, I believe, correctly, because, yes, they were probably going to go down to defeat now because the numbers were much smaller and rested. But they understood, one, if they didn't make the rising, they were going to be rounded up and imprisoned and charged with treason. And secondly, as well, I think they had some understanding that they could inflict a political defeat on the British Empire. And I think that's important. The original plan was absolutely, I think, feasible, but the fallback plan was, I think, to try and actually inflict, if you like, a Tet offensive, for people who are old enough to remember. Militarily a defeat, but politically a victory, because it convinced the Americans they couldn't win in Vietnam. And I just want to return to the original plan. The original plan, partly carried out, was to seize Dublin and then to hold Dublin, drawing in what was quite a limited British garrison in Ireland, not much greater in numbers because they'd been denuded by the First World War, a rising in the southwest, and the volunteers from across Ireland moving in on Dublin. In other words, the positions in Dublin were the anvil and the guerrillas coming from outside with a hammer that was going to break it. In the event, of course, the rising went off half-cock, in the sense that the numbers actually involved 1,000 on Easter Monday, rising to 1,500, 2,000 in the course of the week in Dublin. The failure, essentially, I'll come back to it, of the rising outside Dublin, meant that the plan as it existed couldn't be implemented. Now, I'm going to warn you, there's now going to be some military history, so stop waving your hands if you get bored with this. Dublin, as you may know, is a city with the River Liffey dissecting it, running from west to east. Both to the north of the Liffey and the south, there are two canals. The objective of the Republicans was to hold positions around the canals, essentially trying to secure the communications into the city with the main garrisons in the GPO, the forecourts, etc. In other words, to control inner city Dublin and prevent the British reinforcements coming in, because they had very little in terms of the city. That, of course, failed in part because they weren't simply enough volunteers to carry through. For instance, they didn't stop the British getting control of Trinity College, which became very important in the fighting, or from Amiens Street Station, now Connolly Station, which is how they began moving in the first reinforcements from the north. But the second reason in this is why I don't think it's a blood sacrifice, was in terms of the actual fighting. The volunteers in the Irish Citizens' Army put up a very good performance in Easter week and were able to defeat some really bloody noses on the British. The most famous engagement is at Mount Street Bridge, where a regiment of the Sherwood Foresters, virtually untrained, lacking machine guns and hand grenades, because they'd been left behind in Dunleary where they landed, were ordered to march from Dunleary and cross Mount Street Bridge. When they became aware the volunteers were holding Mount Street Bridge, the commander actually asked the British commander of the day, should they take the bridge? Essentially, I think, asked, why don't we just cross another bridge where there's no volunteers whatsoever? Then no one's going to bother us. They were told, no, you have to take the bridge. I think because the British commanders thought these were just sort of some racist, some natives who'd be a show of strength would deal with it. The British advanced on the bridge. They're not used to street fighting. Any experience they've had, last time would be what's called the Great Mutiny in India, the storming of Delhi. They essentially adopt a box formation. I apologise, wave if it gets too boring. A line of soldiers at the front, scanning the positions, and 2 lines down the sides, scanning the side streets and the windows. The problem is when they get to Mount Street Bridge, they're crushed in. And they're massed in a confusion on the bridge, and the volunteers open up, 13 volunteers open up on them, and inflict losses of 234 men killed and wounded in a series of charges by the British, before finally they get machine guns and hand grenades which allow them to overcome the volunteer positions. But that was a disaster for the British Army. In North King Street, which is to the north of the Four Courts area of Dublin, the South Staffordshire Regiment, already having engaged the garrison in the South Dublin Union, also becomes sucked into street fighting. And again, really find themselves in a very, very difficult position indeed. At the end of the day, by the end of Easter week, they'd advanced 150 yards down North King Street in the face of volunteer opposition, lost 14 dead and 32 wounded. The volunteers used a very clever plan. They occupied the tenement buildings, shooting down on the British, but they'd also built barricades across the streets. The British became obsessed on the barricades. They kept advancing and taking the barricades, but then discovering the volunteers were firing down on them, were being picked off one by one. Also from snipers across the Lithuanian Mendicity Institute. Eventually a British officer, an unusually clever British officer, decided that maybe what they should do is adopt Republican tactics, got a converted, I think it was a Guinness lorry, but made into an armoured car, drove troops into North King Street, ferried them into the houses, and then told them to rabbit through the houses. But at the end of the day, the volunteers were still holding North King Street and the surrounding area when they were told to surrender by Patrick Spears's orders. Or, thirdly, in the South Dublin Union, an engagement with the very same South Staffordshire's, I think it was on the Wednesday, as they were crossing the bridge. That was seen off in heavy fighting. But then, an engagement firstly at the beginning of the Rising by troops occupying what's now Euston Station, where they entered the South Dublin Union, but then eventually withdrew. But then the Staffordshires, on their way to King Street, decided they had to take the South Dublin Union because they were firing on them crossing the Rialto Bridge across the Liffey. Again, the British got into the headquarters building of the volunteers, the nurses' home. They burrowed through it. Inside the hall of the nurses' home, they then became involved in a massive gun battle, hand grenade battle, with a big barricade. The vice commander of the volunteers, Cahill Brew, was very severely wounded, but continued fighting. So essentially the British were trying to throw grenades over the barricade. The volunteers were replying with their homemade bombs, and eventually the British withdraw. And again, the South Dublin Union garrison were ordered eventually to surrender, were quite shocked, as were most, because they believed they were winning in terms of it. So, in terms of the actual performance, it was only when the British managed to bring up 4 field guns from the Curragh and begin picking off in the GPO, the headquarters, finally, of course, on the Saturday, forcing them to, 100 years ago to the day, forcing them to withdraw from the burning GPO, eventually arriving in Moore Street, and then Pearse ordering the surrender. Interestingly, to stop the civilian losses which were now going on as a consequence of the British bombarding central Dublin. I can also mention the retributions taken out in North King Street, where there was a massacre carried out by the British on the inhabitants of the tenements. Most of the volunteers really believed they were winning right the way through to the end. Now, I've got time to pay a scope to this. Worth pointing out that I will just mention it, that the women of Cumberland and Ban who took part in the Rising associated with the volunteers did not take part in the fighting. I think as a socialist conference we should be proud that was not the case of the Irish Citizens' Army. The women, Countess Markievicz, Margaret Skinner, did take place in the fighting. Margaret Skinner was wounded in that fighting. Markievicz famously boasted about shooting a British soldier that shot her. In contrast, in Boland's Mill, a warning of what might come about in the News 26 County Dublin, Eamon de Valera, the commandant, refused women any role whatsoever, even cooking or nursing in Thames. And I want to end really by 2 things. There was also something else going on in the Rising. Sorry, before I do that, I think there is some criticism of the strategy in the sense that lots of those garrisons, and the big garrisons like Bowmansville, weren't really involved in any fighting whatsoever. The evidence in Mount Street, King Street and elsewhere is by if they dispersed more and occupied more of the took positions around the bridges, crucial street corners and so on, it would be even more effective. But I'm trying to point out that actually this was a serious battle, prepared for carefully, in which actually the British did not come out fantastically well until they were able to bring in their artillery. But also, there's something else that has to be said. While outside of Dublin the Rising was abortive in most areas, in 3 areas the Rising did succeed. In Enniscorthy, to a lesser extent, the volunteers seized the town, and again were only surrendered after the news came through from Dublin. In County Galway, William Mellors had so many men, some 2,000 people under his command, he had to send some home, he had no weapons. They avoided a tactic of keeping on the move, trying to attack the RIC police barracks in order to get arms, and again they continued all the way through until when they heard of the surrender, they dispersed, not defeated. And most important, in North Dublin County, where Thomas Ashe, backed up by Richard Mackay, carried out a very similar strategy, keep on the move. Attacking 2 RIC barracks, overcoming them, getting the weapons from those barracks, and then attacking a 3rd on the Friday, when a column of 100 RIC came up to relieve the barracks. The volunteers, despite being outnumbered, fought and eventually defeated the column of 100 and took the barracks. Now this was, to quote John McBride just before he marched off to surrender, one of the commanders was, "Don't ever lock yourselves up in these big buildings again." This was the guerrilla tactics which would come to fruition in 1920-21 being played out already. And in Frongog, the prison compound in Wales, most of them were sent. This is actually what they began to study. Not a repeated night of seizing the GPO, but using these hit-and-run tactics come through. So I would argue the 1916 Rising was a serious military operation. I think it was a political operation as well, led by a talented bunch of people. I think one of the problems, and James is going to talk about this much more, and actually I think this does come out in Roy Foster's book. I find it difficult to believe he wrote this book, but particularly for the women of that generation and what they looked for, the reality of the counter-revolution and the reality of first the Free State and then De Valera's Ireland was one of immense betrayal. Exclusion from work and effectively from public position, refusal of birth control, abortion, of course, the imposition of a very, very rigid and puritanical regime. It was the antithesis of what those people, Maud Gonne McBride, Countess Markievicz, Rosamund Jacob, Margaret Skinner, the antithesis of what they had fought for and come through. And I have to say, I'm going to end in this note, the final thing is that blood sacrifice, and I want to repeat it. Rereading the 1916 proclamation, a difficult document, I imagine, to write, written by Joseph Plunkett and James Connolly, so competing positions here, and it explains some of the things in it. But actually, it stands up to the test of time. It's not a workers' republic, but it's an advanced democratic republic, far beyond anything which existed anywhere in the globe at the time. In fact, it had only superseded in its vision of society by the October Revolution over a year later. So this wasn't some, as I say, futile blood sacrifice. This was a serious project, and if it had succeeded, of course, and just to end on, it would have represented a massive blow to the First World War. As it was, and Cathy will be talking about this, about the impact of the Rising in the Caribbean, as it was, and the British were very aware of this, it had an immense impact across the British Empire, and particularly in India. And I haven't got time to talk about this, but one of the most fascinating empires is in 1935, when a group of Bengali nationalists seized Chittagong, taking over the post office and declaring a republic. Far from a history of non-violent action, of course, Indian independence involved a lot of violence and a lot of insurrection as well. But Sundar Chamba Bose points out that his whole generation, particularly in Bengal, had been reading the memoirs of Irishmen like Tom Barry, Dan Breen. And the impact of the Rising, just in terms of what it meant for the British Empire, should not be forgotten. This was a body blow to the British Empire, from which it was not going to recover, even though in 1918 it actually reached its apogee in terms of the red on the map. already its days were numbered, and of course they were numbered at least in 26 counties of Ireland, and the significance of that is really important.
In the official commemorations for 1916 in the Republic, there has been levels of banality that beggar belief. And one example is the Remembrance Wall in Glasnevin Cemetery, which bears the names of all who died in the Rising: the Irish, the British, the military and the civilians. And Chris has just been talking about this. James Connolly's name is above that of Harry Dickinson. Harry Dickinson is of the South Staffordshire Regiment, the regiment responsible for the killing of 15 civilians in North King Street in that massacre of Easter week. And the rationale for this is that it's a kind of in that beloved post-peace process term, inclusivity. And there's a kind of a faux cosmopolitanism which wishes to distance itself from the parochial nationalism of the past to suggest this kind of inclusive, forward-thinking nation which can in some way sanitise the revolutionary impact of the Rising by turning it into a human tragedy. And it's really that revolutionary impact that I want to talk about today. In August 1916, the towering African-American intellectual and activist W.E. Du Bois wrote in the Crisis magazine, quote, "Today we must remember that the white slums of Dublin represent more bitter depths of human degradation than the black slums of Charleston and New Orleans, and where human oppression exists, there the sympathy of all black hearts must go. The recent Irish revolt may have been foolish, but would to God some of us have the sense to be fools." In the same issue of the Crisis, an African-American subscriber to the magazine, Alonzo P. Holly, writes a letter requesting that the Crisis petition on Roger Casement's behalf. Alonzo insists, quote, "He deserves the lasting gratitude of the Negro race for fearlessly exposing the merciless atrocities of the Congo." This letter asks that the British ambassador be lobbied to ensure that this, quote, "benefactor of our race" be spared the death penalty. Following Casement's execution, the Crisis pays tribute to a life spent in witnessing acts of oppression and lawlessness. He died an Irish patriot whose memory will be cherished at every Irish fireside as one who died for his country. So I want to speak today about the impact of the Irish Revolution on a very particular constituency, black communities in the US. In fact, probably even smaller, more Afro-Caribbean migrants within the black community in the US. There'll just be one bloke by the end. And I'm also kind of stretching the contours of 1916 here to include the aftermath and the years of the War of Independence, because these were symbolically mobilised by a generation of African Americans and Afro-Caribbean migrants living in the US. My research focuses the black radical press of this period, and because this material is so rich, I will be quoting from it, hence the faffing with the PowerPoint. Essential to understanding the importance of the Irish struggle to African American politics in this period is the influence of Afro-Caribbean migrants to the US in the first decades of the 20th century. Indeed, it is very fitting that this year of the centenary of the Easter 1916 is also the bicentenary of the slave rebellion, Bruce's Rebellion in Barbados in Easter 1816. Between 1906 and 1926, over 125,000 migrants from the Caribbean arrived in the US, with over 60,000 of those settling in New York. And they were shocked when they arrived, because although you had in the Caribbean a kind of a quite strict race-class hierarchy, these were black majority islands, and the complex pigmentocracy that existed in the Caribbean engendered a politics of race which was very different in form and in structure to US racial segregation. So in America, these Caribbean migrants found themselves part of a despised minority. Moreover, I think this is hugely significant, these were men and women who were grown up as subjects of British colonial rule, and they had a very particular relationship to the politics of anti-colonialism. So those who arrived from the Caribbean were greeted with a vicious racism, which was experienced in all of its variegated forms. According to the Jamaican poet and activist Claude McKay, he says, "It was the first time I had ever come face to face with such manifest, implacable hate of my race, and my feelings were indescribable. I had heard of prejudice in America, but never dreamed of it being so intensely bitter." These radicals were instrumental in forging a race-class anti-colonial politics, a politics that later informs and structures, I would argue, the Communist Party's politics on race. And it's a deep anti-colonial consciousness that was fired by a politics that was inspired by black nationalism, by Marxism, and by enthusiastic support for the Irish Republican struggle. Indeed, Irish republicanism was an inspiration for the leading black nationalist of the day, Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey names the headquarters of the United Negro Improvement Association in Harlem, Liberty Hall. And he does this specifically after the headquarters of the ITGWU in Dublin, where the leaders of the Rising assembled on Easter Monday. Of the Easter Rising, Garvey proclaimed, quote, "They have sacrificed their lives for Ireland, and all true Negroes must be ready likewise to sacrifice their lives for the Negro fatherland and for their people." Garvey aside, however, because that's the only place he fits here, so we might come back to him or not. Garvey aside, for the championing of the Irish struggle generally was indicative of a politics of class, race and nation, and a manifest commitment to internationalist anti-racism, one which insisted always on the primacy of race, but did so in order to broaden the boundaries of race politics. As Bruce Nelson has pointed out, Irish republicanism signified in quite different ways to these radicals. For Claude McKay, it was a romantic idea, an idea embodied in the Irish themselves as fighters against colonial rule. As he stated in his article, How Black Sees Red and Green for Eastman's Liberator in 1921, quote, "I react more to the emotions of the Irish than to those of any other whites. They are so passionately primitive in their loves and hates. They are quite free of the disease which is known in bourgeois phraseology as Anglo-Saxon hypocrisy. I suffer with the Irish, I think I understand the Irish. My belonging to a subject race entitles me to some understanding of them, and then I was born and reared a peasant. The peasant's passion for the soil possesses me, and it's one of the strongest passions in the Irish Revolution." For the journalist and activist Cyril Briggs from the island of Nevis, it was precisely the traditions of armed struggle, of secrecy in the IRB, which was his main inspiration. Robert Hill has characterised Briggs as, quote, a representative of black fenianism in the new Negro movement. The organisation which both Mackay and Briggs belonged to was the African Blood Brotherhood, and that name in itself was a nod to the IRB. Other leading figures of the ABB were Hubert Harrison, W.A. Domingo, Richard Moore and Otto Hall. In his autobiography, Black Bolshevik, which sounds brilliant but it's extremely boring, the American-born later Communist Party member Harry Haywood recounts the impact of a meeting of Irish revolutionaries, Irish revolutionaries at the University of the Toilers of the East in Moscow in the early 1920s. And Haywood says, "As members of oppressed nations, we had a lot in common. But what impressed me most about them was their sense of national pride. Not of the chauvinistic variety, but that of revolutionaries aware of the international importance of their independence struggle and the role of Irish workers." So, a national pride is articulated here in opposition to chauvinism. A national pride which for Haywood seeks to inspire across the national boundaries. And this is what impresses. Certainly this is the way the ABB interpret the Irish struggle. As I said, my work focuses on the black radical press in the US, and therefore the formation of a very particular type of race-class politics, in which Ireland is mobilised symbolically. It's what's symbolised by Irish republicanism which inspires these activists. So the ubiquitous references to Ireland in the black press is rarely one that's informed, as Haywood is here, by actual engagement with particular individuals or groups. It's what the Irish Revolution represents in terms of self-defence and liberation. In 1919, the US Military Intelligence Division reported, quote, "All of the coloured speakers in Harlem are using the Irish question in their discussions." So this isn't just in terms of the radicals I'm looking at. Ireland is extremely important. And the renewed political urgency in US black politics that emerged in the wake of the First World War, I think is important for understanding the way in which Ireland gets mobilised. The newspaper of the African Blood Brotherhood was called The Crusader, and it maintained that black people needed to make common cause with the Indians and the Irish Republicans, with Soviet Russia, and with all the forces, now or in the future, menacing the British Empire in particular and the capitalist imperialist world in general. The editor of The Crusader was Cyril Briggs, who emigrated to New York from Nevis in 1905, and he worked as a journalist in the United States, most famously for the Amsterdam News. He was fired from the Amsterdam News for his anti-war stance. And he's a really prestigious presence in The Crusader. He writes under his own names and many others as well. And the importance of the Irish struggle for this newspaper and others of the period can't be disentangled from another revolutionary moment which also dominates in the pages of the Black Radical press, and something that Chris referred to at the end of his talk. Because the October Revolution of 1917, which I'm dealing with very cursorily today, but it's key for the tenor of the anti-colonial politics that I'm discussing. As Du Bois argued in 1920, he said, "In Ireland and Russia have arisen the greatest spiritual movements of the 20th century." Garvey's Negro World newspaper insisted that in the colours of the UNIA flag there was, quote, "red to show sympathy with the reds of the world, and green their sympathy for the Irish in their fight for freedom." And Bolshevism was particularly attractive to black radical activists for a variety of reasons. First and foremost is Lenin's thesis of self-determination for oppressed nations, but also particularly the reputation of the Bolsheviks in defending minorities. As Mackay stated in 1921, "Bolshevism has made Russia safe for the Jew. It might make these United States safe for the Negro." And there's also the early Comintern's stated commitment to anti-colonialism and anti-racism in the form of a plethora of decrees and resolutions. So the Comintern here is the first socialist movement which attempts to link the cause of the industrial proletariat with anti-colonial struggles. Also, as Winston James has argued quite simply, the Bolsheviks were the deadly enemies of black people's enemies, which meant that Lenin and Trotsky were their friends. This is The Crusader. What is Russian Bolshevism's attitude towards people of other countries, especially oppressed people like Africans, Indians and the Irish? Bolshevism, from the international standpoint, is totally different from and wholly opposed to imperialism. So Bolshevism dominates the black press. But if Russian communism offered a model for challenging racism and colonialism, Irish republicanism was modelled in similar ways, but mostly it was offered as an example of anti-colonial bravery. Support for the Irish cause, symbolism of the Easter Rising were trumpeted as part of an international revolutionary anti-colonial call. This is kind of typical. There's a very particular tone to the Crusader in particular. The mighty tyrant is not to be toppled over by an unaided Ireland, however courageously her valiant sons may fight, nor yet by an Africa or India unaided. England, menaced only at one quarter at the same time, can successfully defend her ill-gotten spoils and her bleeding conquests, can easily maintain her graveyard peace, her boasted Pax Britannia. But England, menaced on all quarters at the same time, faced by the determined bayonets of all her subject peoples, will be England at the end of a rope. And until England is brought to the end of her rope, there will be no freedom for Ireland, India or Africa. This is a passage that is calling for an internationalist uprising to lynch British rule. It is a localised global vision in which the Irish, the Indian, the African and the African American not only have a shared aim, but also a shared interest. England must be menaced from every corner of the empire, and by extension, all British colonial subjects must imagine their local struggles in terms of an international one. Moreover, elsewhere, Irish self-determination was seen as an exemplar for black liberation. No people have suffered, this is the Messenger, the Socialist Party newspaper, Black Socialist Party newspaper. No people have suffered, sacrificed, bled and died more willingly and freely for the right of self-determination than they. Be it said to the undying honour and credit of the Irish patriots that they never faltered, never equivocated, never retreated a single step before one of the most merciless foes that ever unsheathed a sword. We hail the victorious march of the Irish people towards complete nationalism as a signal contribution to the cause of human liberty. We bid them onward, upward, forward. Now that Irish nationalism is flowering forth into self-determination, the Irish workers are free to fight for a true republic. I just want to pause for a second here and point out that given the sheer levels of racism in the United States in this period, it is quite extraordinary that African Americans who were attempting in the pages of their newspapers to battle against the denigration of black history, black achievement, should accord so much space to the white Irish. And the Irish, in fact, often are imagined outside those binaries of black and white. The Crusaders' impassioned demand for solidarity with the Irish is one where race is often reframed in relation to the Anglo-Saxon. So there's a very particular type of anti-colonial race politics here, which foregrounds the shared oppression and shared oppressor as the basis for solidarity. I'll come back to the Anglo-Saxon, it's important, I think. The bridging language of this shared oppression is the language of bravery. It is to the language of bravery that these kind of bonds of solidarity can be forged. And again, this is typical of the tone. The Irish fight for liberty is the greatest epic in modern history. It is a struggle that should have the sympathy and active support of every lover of liberty, of every member of an oppressed group. The Negro, in particular, should be interested in the Irish struggle, for while it is patent that Ireland can never escape from the menace of the ever-shadowing empire, so long as England is able to maintain her grip on the riches and manpower of India and Africa, it is also clear that those suffering together under the heel of British imperialism must learn to coordinate their efforts before they can hope to be free. The Crusader holds a particular invective for England, which is variously described in scathing terms. But it also extols the notion of agency in relation to both black politics and Irish politics. The Irish struggle is to be emulated in terms of the active resistance of the Irish to British rule. In other newspapers of the time, there's an engagement more with the intricacies of the politics of nationalism itself in relation to class. As A. Philip Randolph writes in The Messenger, he says, the goal of Sinn Féinism is an independent Ireland. It is a radical Irish nationalism. Its birth marked the entrance of the Irish question upon a genuinely uncompromising plane which immediately focused worldwide attention. In the use of methods, the Sinn Féiners were driven to the adoption of tactics similar to those employed by the Ulsterite and Unionist forces. That is, they matched force with force. Thus, in light of their nationalistic struggles, there is much to be said in favour of the soundness of Sinn Féinism. But needless to say, the freedom of the Irish people for British rule will not ipso facto emancipate the Irish workers from their tyranny and their industrial masters. Their economic bondage will persist. You see, if the faraway Irish can be imagined as heroic anti-colonial brothers here, in a common struggle against the Anglo-Saxon, what of Irish Americans? And this is a little trickier. Because the fact that the radicals of the African Blood Brotherhood, most from a Caribbean background, could unproblematically envision the Irish as brave fighters against racial injustice was facilitated by their background in a myriad of ways. One of them being the fact that unlike American-born black radicals, they did not have the same history and experience of Irish-American racism to interrupt this radical vision of international brotherhood. American-born activists W.E. Du Bois and Asa Phil Randolph were much more caustic in their approach to the Irish. Philip Randolph called the Irish, quote, the race which Negroes dislike most. So not much ambiguity, although there is ambiguity. In the pages of The Crisis, the newspaper of the NAACP, and the Socialist Party's paper The Messenger, support for the Irish struggle is trumpeted, but it's inflected to speak more directly to the historical experiences of African Americans in relation to Irish American racism. So Du Bois expresses this in September 1919. He says, from long tradition, since the draft riots of the Civil War, Negroes have had no sympathy with the Irish. But now they must not rest in this unreason. Let every coloured man read this month A History of Ireland. If he does not rise from it bitter with English cruelty and hypocrisy, he is callous indeed. 6 months later, he writes, and we who suffer in slavery and degradation, shall we hesitate to extend a hand of sympathy to the Irish, simply because their descendants in America are so largely followers of American snobbery? We must not forget that Irish Americans like John Boyle O'Reilly and Archbishop John Ireland and Irishmen like Daniel O'Connell have always recognised Negroes as fellow men. Now this is very, very, very different in tone to Briggs' breathless enthusiasm. The spectacle of a little people intrepidly and tirelessly opposing the might of the world's greatest empire and oppressor is one which must thrill all lovers of liberty and give birth to aspirations of freedom and emulation of daring deeds in the breasts of all oppressed peoples in the world. So in the Crusader, in particular, the Irish colonial struggle is seen to complicate, as I said, Irish allegiance in terms of race. But despite the different emphasis in the various publications, there is a notion of the Irish as a Celt. The Irish are cast as a common enemy of the Anglo-Saxon rather than as white, for all sorts of historical reasons we might want to talk about or not. Again, this is the Crusader. The Irish people and the Negro people have much in common. To begin with, they are both oppressed by stronger groups. Secondly, the oppressors in the main of both Celts and Negro are identified with the Anglo-Saxon race. Thirdly, the great enemy of the Irish people is also the greatest enemy of the Negro people. Not only does Great Britain tyrannise it over more Negroes and other coloured races than are ruled by any other nation in the world, but Great Britain is also the bulwark of the Anglo-Saxon White Guards and all the reactionary things for which they stand. Allied to this subtle relocation of the Irish as first and foremost victims of Anglo-Saxon colonialism is the assertion of a radical politics of self-defence. And again, this is seen as being embodied in the example of the Irish struggle for independence. Again and again in the radical press, the Irish are summoned as fighters, as agents of rebellion. As Hubert Harrison puts it in 1917, Negroes will fight back as they are already fighting back, and they will be more highly regarded, as are the Irish, because of fighting back. And again, the ABB constantly extol the virtues of the Irish willingness to act against empire. There is little doubt that the Irish principle of when you fight, fight is soon to be vindicated, and Irish sacrifices for liberty crowned with great and important, if not complete, success. Again, coming back to the myth of the blood sacrifice, what people say about here is fighting. It is fighting and agency, and that is inspirational, not dying, in relation to these African American radicals. And this insistence on active resistance, for which the Irish Revolution is seen as exemplary, is pervasive in discussions about Ireland. Terence MacSwiney's hunger strike is reported widely in the black press at the time. The Messenger delightedly recalled that, quote, the Lord Mayor of Cork mocks the British Crown with the hunger strike in Brixton Prison. Cyril Briggs compares MacSwiney with the radical white abolitionist John Brown. The Crusader insists that, quote, organised force is the only language intelligible to all the world, the only language that Europeans understand in dealing with coloured races, and the foundation upon which all white civilization is in reality based. So the commitment to anti-colonial solidarity with Ireland emerges in the context of race and class in this period, the attacks on Irish Americans by racist mobs, particularly in 1919, the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution, and a powerfully articulated anti-colonialism on a generation of Caribbean radicals who were drawn to Irish republicanism. And the kind of race-class anti-colonial politics which emerge and which develop in this period are politics which insist on race pride and active resistance to racism, but also place itself in the context of a global anti-colonialism, hence the importance of the Irish struggle, and later, eventually, an anti-capitalism. So the Easter Rising, these struggles which follow, deeply impressed and influenced these radicals. And in the context of the almost parodic display that has marked the official St. Thierry events in Ireland this year, registering the impact of the Rising not just as something that the world knew about, but as an event which became central to a whole new form of anti-racist, anti-colonial politics, seems really quite important. And I will leave it there.
But I've got pictures which will probably slow everything down. So that's my book that I've written with Kevin, who's not here. He's in Belfast doing his little rising. Here, what I'd like to do mostly is just concentrate on the Rising as an event in empire, as a colonial conflict. Chris has already stolen the best lines, so thank you. And but what I'd quite like to do is just because I think one of the difficulties people have as they look back and talk about it as an event is it seems quite strange. You know, people in uniforms jumping into the GPO and shooting, and there was no consultation exercise. You know, there was no impact assessment done. It's not really very 21st century. It's much more of its time, and that's really what I want to say is that these events do seem a bit strange because the times were quite very, very different. And one of the main things I think is about empire and the crisis of empire. I think that's the main way to try and understand these events and also their ramifications subsequently, which we've heard a lot about, which I've really enjoyed both those papers on the ramifications and consequences as well. The main thing I want to say is that if you think of this kind of activity, people shooting looks a bit not very modern day, but and people like this seem a bit extraordinary by our modern standards. But I think the main way to see it is it's a time of crowds. This is an era of crowds, of mass crowds. This is a mass society. It's not as individuated, perhaps, as our modern day society. It's a time of great mobilisations, of physical mobilisations of people on the streets, and that's a good way to try and understand what's taking place. One of the great mobilisations, of course, is the Labour socialist left mobilisation that's been carrying on from the 1880s through to the crises in 1905 and again in 1911 that bring these kind of people out on the streets. This is the Dublin knockout. This is fighting the Dublin knockout. What's happening in all these events is that the ordinary people, the poor people, the working people, are beginning to... This is just going on and on, isn't it? Don't go on. Maybe I'll do it the other way. Hang on. I'll do it like this. So the point about the socialist movement is it had a tremendous popular appeal that was pulling people away from their rulers. And I think that was the most profound thing. And naturally, rulers had to have a response. They had to have a reply to that appeal. And the appeal that their response really is derived from their own idea of who they are and the society they think they lead, which is militarism. I think the core of it is a militaristic, nationalistic movement, and it's universal across Europe, and it's very kind of hands-on, and it involves there's lots of propaganda. There's the Dreadnought campaign to get new ships to challenge Germany. The papers called The Imperialist that are on sale, and all these are really attempts to prise the red flag out of people's hands and put the Union Jack into their hands. So, and it's a dangerous game. I want to say this: it's a very dangerous game for people in charge because they are mobilising people. They're not demobilising. They're getting them out on the streets. And all across Europe, there's a great movement of mobilisation of militias, right-wing movements like Action Française. There's all kinds of kind of thug militias that have been put together to suppress Labour. And as you kind of see that picture, what you see in Ireland doesn't look quite as strange as it does, say, from today's perspective, because Ireland, like all of Europe, has got a lot of people under arms, marching about, demonstrating their fortitude and their determination for one cause or another. And it's got a kind of a thug militia, not to put too fine a point on it, which is the Ulster Volunteer Force, which has been mobilised to prevent democratisation, to vet moderate, as has been said, a moderate democratisation. And that, in a sense, it calls forth a response from Irish nationalists who organised their own volunteers in competition to defend Home Rule. In the first instance, the ambitions of the nationalists is only for Home Rule, and it is right through up until late 1915. You'd still say that the Irish Parliamentary Party held a majority of the country, though it was slipping away quite markedly. And also that this was a tremendous problem. It was a huge problem for the British elite. All this kind of mobilisation, and they come to look on the events in Ireland as a terrible quagmire, a deadlock, something that they kicked off that they didn't know where it was going to end up. It seemed to involve mutinies and disobedience and a general anxiety for the ruling classes, and it was married with lots of other problems. The massive labour problem. There's a huge suffragette movement is sweeping through Britain, and there's a real sense in Parliament and on the front benches of this impending crisis and of the impossibility of democratic politics to deal with it. There's a great moment where Lloyd George draws up this memorandum, and he says, all this. These events are too big. We can't have democracy. It's not really working. We'll have a government of national unity. This is before the war. He says the Tory front bench and the Liberal front bench will get together and resolve these questions without the terrible echo chamber of Parliament. And they draw up the memorandum, and it's agreed by the front bench and of the two parties. It's only the backbenchers who kick off about it. But it shows you the instinct, and their instinct really is about a dread of mobilisations and a fear that democracy can't work and that they will have to resort to a kind of dictatorial rule. So this is the kind of mood in amongst the elite, that they think democracy is just a bit of a luxury by this point and not something they can work with. And then so they're coping with these mobilisations in Ireland and labour conflict, and then the war comes. The war comes, and it's quite intriguing the way they talk about the war. I've got this quote. I can just find it here. This is what Lloyd George was saying. He says, blah blah blah. I could just pause you a minute. So he says what the war does is it came. He says then there came a real war. He says there came a real war like a mighty rushing wind. It's not very well written. Like a mighty rushing wind, the struggle not of sects and factions, but nations and continents. And the incipient fires of civil war were swept into the great conflagration. See, what he's saying there is that all this trouble, this paralysis of the process of debate, is resolved by the war. And the war, that's how it feels. In the first months and year even of the war, all of the critics are basically silenced because the exigency of war is carrying them forward. Everybody comes cheering the war, and everybody reimagines their position in relation to the war. The Socialist International had vainly promised that they would not fight the war and go on strike instead, and not penny or a man for the imperialist war. Sadly, they were all carried away by the events, and even really radical socialists like Victor Grayson became cheerleaders for the war because they felt close to the people, that they were swept up by those events, and most markedly too in Ireland, because of the degree of the mobilisation, has a traumatic impact on the two factions, the two mobilised factions. So this is what Redmond says. He says, no people can be said to have rightly proved their nationhood and their power to maintain it until they have demonstrated their military prowess. And though Irish blood has reddened the earth of every continent, never until now have we, as a people, set a national army into the field. I think it's important to understand Redmond's gambit is not insane. I think history's shown it to be mistaken. It certainly springs from a false position, in my view. But nonetheless, it's sensible. You can understand what he's doing. He's saying, if we prove our mettle in the war, Britain will grant us self-rule. And we will show ourselves through this heroic act. We will be true men and will have earned our place. And it's a common instinct. In Germany, hundreds of thousands of Jews signed up to join the German army for the same reasons as black Americans signed up in the war, where they were allowed, because it was a way of demonstrating that they were citizens, they were men alongside, so that you can understand what's going on. And then here's think of Carson and the Ulster Volunteers and all the men that they put in the field. The start of the war, Lord Kitchener says, and these men have been a kind of a nuisance. I mean, they were a reserve army for reaction, but they were also a bit difficult. Lord Kitchener says to Carson, he says, could you supply a brigade of Ulster Volunteers, should England call? And Carson says, I shall not supply a brigade. I will supply a division. And that's exactly what happened. It's 200,000 men in the end between them. Redmond and Carson have sent over to France to fight, to spill their blood in pursuit of glory and self-demonstration and self-worth. And there's a terrible moment. There are many defeats and awful injuries inflicted upon the Irishmen of both stripes in the war. But there is one great victory that's celebrated. In fact, in 1998, Paddy Hart of Fine Gael and the Ulster Defence Association's Glen Bar came out to commemorate this great victory at Messines, the Battle of Messines it's called, in 1917. And what happens in the Battle of Messines is there's a joint UVF National Volunteer Army in the field, and they basically ambush a massive division of Germans. 20,000 Germans are killed at Messines Ridge in like one blow with bombs. Basically, they dug underneath them and blew them up.
Where was this?
It's in a place called Messines.
On the in Western Front?
The Battle of Messines. Yes, they're in Spanbroek-Meulen. I don't know Spanbroek-Meulen, but there you go. And so they killed all these guys. The man was there. He says they all went up in the air. Said Bob Grange. I never saw such carnage like it in such a short space. There wasn't a human body intact, just bits and pieces, arms and feet and heads and legs. And that was his experience. And this is what we should celebrate as the joint Irish Ulster nationalist campaign. And you can see that, war does have this effect. The war does have this effect of drawing all of the contradictions into this larger conflict, away from the mere sectarian disputes before and into true heroism on the field. But over time, of course, it has the opposite effect. Sorry, I should say this is. Didn't do that, did I? That's the 7,000 Teutons taken at Messines. Men ran on with their ulster, their orange sash, apparently, saying stick it to them. And this, of course, is the terrible disaster with I think they called ammonium bombs, which they dug underneath the German positions and blew them up. It's not really heroism, I don't think, but I wasn't there, so what do I know? Nonetheless, so yes, heroic demonstration. But of course, none of this really resolves the problems. All that happens is the problems are put back and they reoccur later on. And the way they reoccur is that there's a basic structure of inequality within the British Army, which is that most of the officers most of the officers in charge of the Catholic Irishmen are loyalists. They're Orange men, because these are the men who were more likely in the army and more likely officers, and they treated them rough, like really bad, and knocked them about and sent them over the top, and basically treat them like idiots, and they weren't allowed to have a regimental badge or anything like that. So the whole Irish experience of the war was that you go in, we're going to do our bit and we're going to prove ourselves, and then it's shown to you that actually no, you're just as your grandfather was before you, some sap who's cannon fodder for this war. And instead of resolving the problem, it comes back. So over time, you can see why the Irish Parliamentary Party's authority begins to fall away, because the victories aren't really coming. The glory is not coming, and the honour and the success for Ireland is not coming. All that's really coming is telegrams telling you that your son is dead, and so that by the time of 1916, it's clear that the whole military exercise is not one of success, and the meaning of the volunteers shifts. I think that's the point, is that to be a volunteer is transformed, because it's now they're listening to Jim Larkin's advice is to carry guns on your own behalf. And this, I think, is the meaning of the 1916 rebellion, is that it's the break, it's the moment when all the tensions of war break. There's a great quote from C.L.R. James where he says, look, he says, it's the 25th anniversary of the Rising. He says, look, this is the moment when it broke. This is the first point when there's a real strike against the war, an actual blow against the war. So there have been mutinies, there have been occasional disputes amongst the forces, but he says this is a real systematic moment where the first break in the imperialist war effort. And I think he's right. Now, subsequently, many more dramatic events, even more dramatic events, overtook these events, and in the end, Bolshevik Revolution, obviously, in terms of worldwide impact, is much greater. The German Revolution is effectively what brought the war to an end. So all of these kind of, 1916 is massively important because it's the beginning of the end. And I think the beginning of the end takes us through to the points where people all over throughout the war are rebelling against the war. They're rebelling either as socialists or as nationalists or as fighting for their freedom. But the war is breaking apart, and that's, I think, is basically how I can see what 1916 is. It's the point where the British war effort disintegrates. That that anti-recruitment is one of the core features that Sinn Féin builds its support after 1916. The anti-recruitment drive is the Anti-Conscription League is the format which they use to make the appeal, and they organise. Finally, the Socialist International's promise is fulfilled, because in Ireland they do organise an actual general strike. It takes place in April 1918. Irish Trade Union Congress issue an appeal. It's a bit of a strange general strike because all the bosses are in it as well. It's a quite complicated affair, but it's a national event, and they say, look, they put out their call. They say, it's time you shucked it off. It's time that you take up arms against the war. And this was an appeal that was alive in Ireland at that time. So really, both the Rising and the Independence War that shortly followed it, these are real events that are marking the end of the war. And they're not inspirational necessarily. I don't think Germans were particularly interested in what was going on in Ireland. I looked, Rosa Luxemburg wasn't very sympathetic. I think actually a lot of German Marxists were a little bit Anglophile, I mean, for obvious or complicated reasons, Kautsky and the like, and weren't very impressed. Obviously, on the other hand, Russians were. Lenin famously issued his instruction to the British Communist Party. He said, "Thank you very much for your hands-off Russia campaign. Wouldn't you think it a good idea to undertake a hands-off Ireland campaign?" And there was a hands-off Ireland campaign in Britain, but I don't want to do too much on Britain. So really see the conflict as part of the imperialist war breaking down. Of course it has its own local ramifications, but that's what it is. And I think that's why also the other thing I'd like to say is that as this conflict is the post-war conflict, of these armed militias, of these men that had been in the war and now turned into militias, as they were in Germany. The Freikorps were going around beating people up and killing people, and the Freikorps has its parallel in the Black and Tans. These are demobilised servicemen arming the reaction. And it shows you what a nonsense it was to think that Britain could hand over peacefully home rule at the end, because it's a misunderstanding of where Britain was at that point. Wars don't encourage progressive, forward-looking, democratising movements. They encourage backward, reactionary, militaristic militias, and that was really what Ireland looked like, was kind of what Germany looked like in 1919. Guys in shabby uniforms suppressing popular movements, a bit like him. Not so shabby. Inside maybe. Here's the other thing, is that, and people have alluded to this, is that because it was the colonial war, it was the break in the colonial war, Ireland's revolution was an inspiration. And this is the Hindi copy of Dan Breen's book, My Fight for Irish Freedom. And it was, Michael Silvestri found this in the records somewhere. There are actually 4 separate editions in 4 different languages. It was in Burmese, Tamil, Hindi. All these were put out by different Indian nationalists. Burmese was a Burmese edition. Different nationalists in the empire. And as the officers looking at it, the English officers in the report from which this surviving copy was found, they say it's a handbook for revolution. This Dan Breen, it's no wonder these Burmese guys are reading it, and these Tamils and these Bengalis are all reading this. They're lapping it up because it's all about us getting beat. And of course it was a massive inspiration. Of course it was a massive inspiration to subject races all through the empire. As you've said, it was the heroism of the blow was the truly kind of dramatic thing. There was also in 1920, though it never really made a connection with the national movement at the time in India, Jalandhar, there's the Connaught Rangers, who are Irish division, are there in India, kind of guarding the British Empire for the British, and they say, hang on a minute, they say, what's this? Revolution in Ireland? Well, that's what side we're on, obviously. We're the Connaught Rangers. So they take over their camp, they go on strike, they put up a flag, a green flag, they call it the Sinn Féin Rebellion. There's no correspondence taking place. It's all going on in their heads, but it's a real event because they've made it into a real event by taking up arms against it. The Indians are kind of looking on, not really registering it, but afterwards, subsequently, of course, it becomes a massive thing, and they go to the graves of the grave of James Daly, who was executed for his part in the Rising. and it becomes a kind of dramatic moment for Indian nationalists. And as has already been alluded, there was an actual Easter Rising. Easter's not even an event in the Bengali calendar, but nonetheless they organise an Easter Rising because they're using the Handbook of Revolution that Bambery has given them. Not just, the Indians, Burmese, all kinds of people, not necessarily majorities. Some of these revolts were a bit half-cocked, but they did galvanise substantial numbers, intellectuals and beyond, who was profoundly impressed, like Subhash Chandra Bose, who went to visit Ireland to interview everybody. Basically, he talked to both sides, interestingly. He talked to the pro and the anti-treaty to get as much advice as he could on how to challenge the British Empire. And famously, Ho Chi Minh was there doing his washing up. He was a washer-upper in a Paris hotel. He was there, actually. He was part of the Communist International. This story's a bit overwrought. He knew exactly what was going on. But as he says in various memoirs, he says, I was crying, he says, when Terence McSweeney died on the hunger strike, because I knew then no people could be defeated led by such men. And he described himself crying into the washing up, which is a brilliant little oeuvre. But bear in mind, of course, as a member of the Communist International, he was in constant contact with all different people, and the Communist International brokered many meetings between Indian nationalists and Irish Republicans. Though, of course, their leader, De Valera, kept the Soviet Union at hand's length because he didn't want to lose the Irish-American support, which was so valuable to him. And bear in mind also, my last point I want to say on the impact on the colonial impact, it had huge impact everywhere where there were Irishmen, and Irishmen in New Zealand and in Australia were, like Irishmen in Ireland, were basically Redmond supporters and were a bit miffed by the Rising when they first heard it. And afterwards, like many Irishmen too, as the killings started, the executions, they began to change their minds. And it was a profound spasm through both Australia and New Zealand, which had very, very sizable Irish populations. In fact, it split the Australian Labour Party, half of whom decided that they wouldn't support the war and became a kind of anti-war party, the Australian Labour Party. Most of those, because the Irish were heavily represented in the working classes, there would have been Irish Australian Labour Party supporters. So huge impact, ramifications all through, emblematic of another way a resistance to British Empire has been demonstrated through the act of the Rising and the subsequent fight. I have got more pictures, but I think I've maybe said my piece, which is, so the last thing, of course, is that what happens after is a whole other discussion. And the one way that the Rising is being dishonoured was to make it into an official state religion of a rather mean-spirited government that De Valera built on the kind of backs of the various defeats, which, got him trooping the colour. And, here's some school kids, I think, doing a kind of mock-up little serenade. But of course, it was always open. If you make a revolution as part of your national template, it can always be taken from you. And this is two radical Republicans blew up Nelson's monument in Dublin in 1956, 66, sorry, and then again in 76. The Irish government, in its fit of insanity, decided they would ban the commemoration of their own of the revolution that out of which, in some circuitous way, their state had come. But of course, all that meant was that the Sinn Féin took it from them, and these, as you can see, Dahi O'Connell and Roy O'Brady, all there seizing the mantle of the revolution that the government of the Free State will not carry. So I think I better stop there.
Okay.
Is that a good way?
Finally, but by no means least, John Newsinger. Will it come round this way, John?
Shall I
Sit there, I don't mind. Yeah, should be okay, I think.
I mean, this is not the first collection from the Woman's Dreadnought that was published regarding the Easter Rising. Pankhurst published her own in, I think it was 1919. Her collection was very much a selection of articles that reflected politics in 1919. So, I've not included in this all the things she had in her selection, and on the other hand, some of the things she left out, I have included, because her politics were not the same in 1916 as they later on became. In fact, a good case can be made that the 1916 Easter Rising is one of the events that pushes her in a revolutionary direction and away from a sort of labourist direction, I suppose. I'm sure people were familiar with Sylvia Pankhurst. The left-wing radical member of the family. I mean, they'd all started out as Labourites, but she is the one who remains on the left and becomes increasingly left-wing. The Woman's Dreadnought, I would argue, is one of the most interesting papers on the left in British history. It's a very interesting paper. Claude Mackay, who Cathy mentioned, wrote for it. At the height of the working class upsurge in Ireland after the war, Nora Connolly was its columnist. This is a quite remarkable newspaper that hasn't had the attention it deserves, I would argue. When they set it up, when the East End Federation that Pankhurst had set up, or been part of the group that had set up, the idea was that they hoped to win both working class women and working class men as well over to the cause of women's rights and socialism. This was what the project was. Originally they were going to call it the Workers' Mate. Thank God they never. She was persuaded out of that apparently, and instead they called it the Woman's Dreadnought. It took an interest in Irish affairs quite early on. For example, it reported on the Bachelor's Walk massacre in 1914, which Chris mentioned, when you had an attempt to disarm the Irish volunteers who'd smuggled in a comparatively small number of weapons, and the crowd protesting against this was opened fire on by British troops and shot down. This is, I think, a week before the outbreak of war. And she herself visited Dublin and reported on this. And as she points out, and I still find this quite remarkable, at the same time as they took action to disarm the Irish volunteers, regular parades by Ulster volunteers bearing their arms were allowed to take place, not in Belfast, but were allowed to take place in Dublin. You actually had parades by armed Irish volunteers, Ulster volunteers, taking place in Dublin, and yet they took action to try and disarm the Irish volunteers, and people were killed. When you look at, one of the debates I remember is that you used to have the condemnation of the Republicans for bringing bloodshed to the streets of Ireland. And I always thought this was a bit strange from historians who supported the politicians, the Home Rule politicians who sent tens of thousands of Irishmen to die on the Western Front. There always seemed to be a certain, one sort of bloodshed was legal, legitimate and acceptable, and another sort of much lower levels of bloodshed, it has to be said, was somehow not to be considered at all, especially as one of the things that they were fighting about in 1916, of course, was to bring the war to an end. The paper did take a stand quite early on, but I would argue initially the policy it follows in the early stages of the war is I don't know to use the word moderate opposition to the war, but it's more the sort of opposition that Keir Hardie maintained to the war. She was very close to Keir Hardie, as I'm sure people know. When he died, they devoted a whole issue of the Woman's Dreadnought to Keir Hardie's life. And she described him as, I can't remember the exact word, but something like the best man that had ever lived. And they printed a long article by Bernard Shaw saying that the Labour MPs in the House of Commons were absolutely relieved that Keir Hardie was dead, because his opposition to the war was a daily reproach to their sellout. Now you've got to be careful with Bernard Shaw, because he could say one thing that you think, great, what a bloke, and then you find that he, on another occasion, quite soon, had said the exact opposite. But he didn't do this as far as Keir Hardie was concerned. He was reasonably consistent. I mean, in today's New Statesman, there's a letter from Jeff Bell defending Bernard Shaw in the New Statesman today, which I think does bring out the good side of him. Have you heard that phrase about Bernard Shaw? A good man falling among Fabians. I prefer a good man fallen. I don't think you just blame it on the Fabians. There's a really good side to Bernard Shaw, but he could come out with complete crap as well. In fact, Pankhurst herself, who was quite, they worked with Bernard Shaw quite a lot, actually says how annoying it was that he seemed to be completely unaware that he'd said contradictory things, and didn't seem to take any notice of the incongruity of this. And he did speak for the Federation in the East End on a number of occasions. And on one occasion, she actually stood up as the chair after he'd finished and repudiated everything he'd said, which is, this was Bernard Shaw. On some days he was fucking brilliant, and other days, oh my God, why did you invite him? But anyway, this was after Hardie dies, the paper does toughen its stance, its opposition to the war. I would argue. And then you get the Easter Rising. She was in Newcastle, if I remember, when the Rising broke out. And they responded, I think, in an admirable way to the Rising. The article that she wrote, The Irish Rebellion, Our View, opens, and remember, this is a Britain where jingoism is absolutely rife, where the militarism dominated in a way that we can't really imagine today. And the article in the Woman's Dreadnought opened, justice can make but one reply to the Irish rebellion, and that is to demand that Ireland should be allowed to govern itself. This was the response. They, as I'm sure people know, smuggled across into Ireland Patricia Lynch, who was working for the East End Federation. She was a young Irish woman from Cork. Sylvia was going to go herself, but they assumed she wouldn't get into the country. She'd be picked up first. So Patricia Lynch went over, disguised as a schoolgirl returning home from private school, and she provided a report on the state of Dublin, which is reprinted in here, scenes from the rebellion, scenes from the Irish Rebellion, where she provides a very graphic description. As far as she's concerned, the rebellion is absolutely rooted in the terrible poverty that existed in Ireland. She makes the point that the slums have to be seen to be believed in Ireland. And the paper sold out. This issue of the paper sold out, and according to some accounts, they actually reprinted the edition because people were snapping it up because this was a genuine scoop. They managed to get Patricia Lynch into Ireland to report back. As I'm sure some people know, Patricia Lynch goes on to become a very famous children's writer in Ireland, and she married Richard Fox, who some people probably know better as R.M. Fox, he was an engineering worker, but goes on, his memoirs, Smoky Crusade, I think are one of the best working class memoirs, left working class memoirs you can find. Fox goes on to become a historian of the Irish labour movement, of the Irish struggle, and wrote a book on rebel Irish women as well. So these are very interesting people whose time is not just about Easter, but their politics carry on after. When you look at some of the later accounts, she actually said that the Easter Rising was a madcap affair. As far as Sylvia was concerned, the idea of rising up against the British Empire in the middle of the war, this was something that was never going to be successful. She actually says that it was a madcap affair. But nevertheless, they made absolutely clear that regardless of that, the Irish people, should be given's the wrong word, should have their freedom, is a better word. They were bitterly opposed to the methods the British had used to suppress the rebellion, and of course they condemned the executions, and in particular they described Connolly's execution, the execution of a wounded man strapped to a chair, as particularly cruel. But one point that I think is later played down in the volume the collection that she published in 1919 was that the thing that particularly exercised them at the time was the summary execution of Francis Shee Skeffington. Now, Shee Skeffington is a very interesting bloke. He was a socialist. He was also a pacifist. He was one of the men who supported suffragism, both in Britain and Ireland. I think Shee Skeffington can claim to be one of the most advanced in terms of his support for feminism, if you want to call it that, in that period. He had been the Daily Herald's correspondent in Dublin during the Dublin lockout. He'd been beaten up by clerical vigilantes at least once, although as a pacifist apparently he used to hit them back. Someone actually said he's the most violent pacifist I've ever come across. That Shee Skeffington was a very interesting bloke. And when the war broke out, he launched a campaign against volunteering. He spoke on a weekly basis to as many people as he could gather in a crowd, condemning the idea of joining up to fight in the war. And there's no doubt he was a real thorn in the side of the British authorities. He was arrested, he was put on trial, and interestingly enough, Connolly published his speech from the dock and with a contribution from Bernard Shaw. Bernard Shaw sent a note of support, and Connolly very cunningly put in big bold capitals every bit of Bernard Shaw's letter that he particularly agreed with, which is quite amusing in a way, because you get Bernard Shaw saying, what we really need is a revolution, and you get, what we really need, it's in absolutely big bold type. Once again, the problem with Bernard Shaw is at the same time he was privately advising the British government on how they could best recruit Irishmen in Ireland to fight for Britain in the war. So you have this bloke who is all over the place, absolutely all over the place. One last point in case I forget. When they opened a fund to raise money for Connolly's family after he was executed, over half the money was donated by Bernard Shaw. This is a bloke who, like I say, there is a really good side to Bernard Shaw, but he was definitely fallen as well, I would argue. Skeffington is picked up by a British officer, Lieutenant Bowen Colthurst, who's on patrol in Dublin. He certainly knows who Shee Skeffington is. He was an Irish unionist, was Bowen Colthurst. He'd been on the Viceroy's staff. He was a person with important connections. And he is one of a number of officers, I would argue, who went around during the Easter Rising executing who they liked. He arrests Shee Skeffington and he takes him out on a patrol where he makes absolutely clear that he's going to use him as a human shield. And if they come under fire, then Shee Skeffington will be pushed out in front, and if he's not killed in the crossfire, then they'll make sure he's dead. On this patrol, with Shee Skeffington going along with him, he summarily executes at least 2 other people, including a teenager who is clubbed to the ground, and then Bowen Colthurst shoots him while he's lying on the ground. And they raid a house of what they believe is a Sinn Féin alderman, but unfortunately they picked a unionist, I think a former Lord Mayor of Dublin, if I remember rightly, who happens to have the same surname. This is the British Army at its best, and they don't knock on the door, they fire a volley into this unionist's home, rush in and arrest the people present. There is a unionist journalist there, and another bloke called P.J. McIntyre, who was a mercenary for hire. He worked for the Sun, if he was alive today. He'd actually edited a scab newspaper during the Dublin lockout, and they are taken back along with She Skeffington to the barracks, and Bowen Colthurst has them put up against a wall and executes all three of them. You know, they are summarily executed. To be honest, he's very unlucky, is Bowen Colthurst. He is an extremely unlucky individual, because there's no doubt there were other officers in Dublin who did exactly the same. Absolutely no doubt whatsoever, and they got away with it scot-free. You'll see why he was unlucky. I think he's one of the most unlucky officers in the British Army, because his superior officer, his immediate superior, happened to be a close friend of Sylvia Pankhurst's. I kid you not. There is a bloke called Sir Henry Vane, who had worked with Sylvia Pankhurst in the East End Federation, being a respectable baronet. He was Irish as well, a respectable baronet. He'd actually smuggled her through police lines because the police didn't interfere with a baronet, you know, so she was with him. They let them through. He drilled as an army officer. He was a retired army officer. He rejoined when the war broke out. He drilled her People's Army. She'd raised an equivalent of the Citizen Army in the East End. Vane had drilled this army, but then he joined up when the war broke out, and he actually took part in the suppression of the Easter Rising. And something she left out of the 1999 edition of the articles that appeared, in 1916, she actually prints, it's included in here, his account of the suppression of the Easter Rising from his point of view. You know, this appears in the Woman's Dreadnought at the time. By 1919, this is something that she's not going to print. And what he does is he objected very strongly to the summary execution of anyone, as far as he was concerned. This was murder and a court-martial offence, and he also particularly objected to the execution of She Skeffington, because he shared not his pacifism, but certainly his commitment to women's rights. And not only is Bowen Colthurst unlucky in this regard, he must have thought, oh my God, how could this happen to me? Not only is he unlucky in this regard, but Vane won't let it go. He won't let it go. He goes public with it. The article that appeared in the Woman's Dreadnought makes absolutely clear that a summary execution took place and they are covering it up. He complained to everyone who would listen. He went to complain at Dublin Castle. He complained to the head of military intelligence, who actually he quotes as saying to him that it's a pretty good idea, actually, that She Skeffington has been put out of the way. This was far from the idea this is something wrong. This was one of the bonuses, if you like, of the Easter Rising, that this troublesome individual was dead as well. And Vane informs, the widow Hannah She Skeffington, who's a substantial person in her own right. He gets in touch with her and lets her know exactly what had happened to her husband. And in the end, as I'm sure people know, Bowen Colthurst eventually they are forced to court-martial him. They actually offered Hannah She Skeffington a financial settlement. She actually met with the Prime Minister, Asquith, and he offered her a financial settlement. And as she herself wrote soon after, at the whole time we were talking, he never once looked me in the eye. He obviously was a politician. What you have is Bowen Colthurst is court-martialed and he's found to be insane. They lock him up for just after a year, and he's then quietly released and emigrates to Canada. There's no doubt it's a complete stitch-up. He'd also executed the leader of the Dublin Labour Party as well. He'd summarily executed him in his travels around Dublin. So this was the scandal, if you like, that excited them most. That the executions were bad, but this was war, and you could condemn it, but nevertheless, this was war. But the summary execution of a pacifist, this was something they reacted to even more ferociously at this time, because it was someone with, I think, the politics that most approximated to Sylvia's at that time had been executed. Do you follow me? By the time she puts the later collection together, her politics have toughened up. But in 1916, they're looking at the execution of someone who really has been killed for having their politics. And they take great exception to this. Now, Claire Wills, in her book on the Easter Rising, argues that really this focus on Shear Skeffington was an attempt to disguise their support for Republican militarism. This is just not true. It completely misses where they were coming from at that period. And there is in the Woman's Dreadnought a mention of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but I think it's clear that no one there had heard of this organisation other than to think it was an aspiration that they were fighting for Irish Republican Brotherhood, rather than it being a secret conspiracy. So you have a situation where this paper, I would argue, takes a very strong stand that flies in the face of the absolute barrage, if you like, of militarist, jingoist sentiment of the day. It takes a very strong stand. It makes clear that the Irish should have independence, and it's not talking about home rule, it's talking about independence. It condemns the repression that has been used in the way that the Rising was put down, the shelling, the killings. They actually say in one article in it that there were British officers boasting that they'd taken the opportunity to put 50 people out of the way. And Vane himself also argued that, as far as he was concerned, there were Irish Unionists in British Army uniform settling scores in Dublin in 1916. Vane's memoirs give you an idea of where he's coming from, because they're called Agin the Governments. So he wasn't a socialist, but he was a bloody nuisance to people in authority. He actually is dismissed from the army for the way in which he pursues the Bowen-Colthurst affair. He's removed from his position and is later on thrown out of the army altogether, but he doesn't let up. And they do play a part, a significant part, I would argue, in exposing this particular scandal and embarrassing the government and at least forcing Bowen-Colthurst to spend a year in a mental hospital before he escapes justice, if you like, to Canada. This is work that I'm still doing at the minute. The Woman's Dreadnought, later on the Workers' Dreadnought, continues its support for the Irish struggle. This support continues right the way through, hopefully this stuff will be published sometime next year. But it is a remarkable newspaper, and it does make you feel, you do feel a certain pride at reading this stuff written at this time by what I would argue were a remarkable group of people whose contribution has been neglected. Part of the reason for this, of course, is a break with the Communist Party, and you get much of the left historiography, if you like, neglects her because of her break. The sort of communist-dominated historiography neglects her because of her break. But when you look at the Dreadnought, it's a remarkable newspaper, it deserves more attention. It deserves to be remembered. That's it.